I am so pleased to be here. I am so thankful for the organizations, including John O'Brien's Catholics for Choice, for National Council of Jewish Women. I saw Sammy Oceanberg for organizing this panel and for creating this coalition. It is perhaps one of the most important gatherings of organizations dedicated to stopping the perversion of the First Amendment that I think has existed in my lifetime. I will just tell you where I come from, where my organization, the National Organization for Women, comes from. We believe there is no constitutional right to be a pharmacist. We don't think there's a constitutional right to be a urologist or an infertility specialist or an OBGYN. We think there is a constitutional right to the free expression of religion and to freedom from religion as well for individuals. Right? My organization is frankly horrified. I am personally horrified. When you look at the spectacle of powerful religious leaders who cannot get their way from the pulpit. They cannot achieve their goals legitimately from the pulpit. So what do? They turn to the United States government to use all of the levers of power of the United States government to get through law what they cannot get through their preaching. 99% of sexually active women in the United States have used birth control at some point. That includes 98% of Catholic women. The vast majority of people in this country who identify with some kind of faith tradition believe that women should make their own health care decisions. As we are, as we say in now and throughout the reproductive justice movement, every woman has the right to have the children she wants, right? To raise the children she has, to plan her own family, and to make her own health care decisions. And no bishop, and no politician, and no Supreme Court justice can legitimately take those rights away from her. Not legitimately anyway. So, as you can see, I feel rather passionately about these issues. And I am really, really thrilled to now have the honor of introducing all of these speakers who are going to talk to us about women's rights and religious liberty, and where we are in this country, where we need to go, and how we can get to where we need to go. So first, what I'm going to do is introduce all of our panelists and then have them talk. And again, I apologize. I do need to leave at about 3:40 or so I'll sneak out the back. But I am really eager to hear what everyone has to say. So to my immediate left is Jessica González-Rojas. She is a longtime social justice leader. She is the executive director of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, and a friend and a comrade in the detention facility where we were held when we got arrested over. Yes, and then a number of people in the room. Sammy was there with us. The mission of the National Latina Institute is to build Latina power, to guarantee the fundamental human right to reproductive health, dignity, and justice of Latina women. The NLIRH elevates Latina leaders, mobilizes families and communities, transforms the cultural narratives, and catalyzes policy change. Sitting directly next to Jessica is Sara Hutchinson, the domestic program director at Catholics for Choice, where she strategizes with policymakers, advocates, and collegial organizations around the country to maintain the right balance in the separation of church and state. To Sara's left is Aram Schvey. Yes? Yes, Aram Schvey. Aram Schvey, who has served as a policy counsel for foreign policy and human rights at the Center for Reproductive Rights since 2010. He previously served as a supervising attorney and fellow in the International Women's Human Rights Clinic and as litigation counsel at Americans United for separation of church and state. And then finally, Lois Backus from Medical Students for Choice, who has led reproductive health and rights organizations for 25 years, during which time she expanded reproductive health services in rural communities in Pennsylvania and Oregon, and has grown Medical Students for Choice from just 87 chapters in the United States and 5 chapters in Canada to 167 chapters worldwide. So thank you all for being here to share your views with us on women's rights and religious liberty. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, we were arrested a couple months ago in support of immigrant women's rights. So these rights should transcend status, economic status, sexual orientation, identity, all those things. So thank you, hermana. So I also want to thank National Council of Jewish Women and Catholics for Choice for being also tremendous hermanos and hermanas in the movement and colleagues. And Latina Institute's part of the Coalition for Liberty and Justice. So we're honored to be here and be part of this discussion. So I'm here today to really bring together the intersections of religious liberty, reproductive justice, and access to health care. It's deeply disappointing for some who want to deny women and LGBT persons access to health care that have cloaked themselves in the language of religious liberty to hide the agenda of discrimination that harms our health and undermines our human rights. The negative impact of these refusals fall hardest on those who already are struggling to get access to health care. When only hospitals within miles refuse to provide the care that people need, and you don't have transportation or you don't have resources, the door is literally slammed shut in the face of a woman in need. This is especially true for Latinas who already face formidable barriers to accessing care and attaining health equity. Couple stats to share. 1 in 3 Latinos are uninsured in this country, and this is a post-ACA world. According to the 2011 census, 25% of Latinas live below poverty. High rates of uninsurance and lack of access to health care is expected to persist even after implementation because of things like immigration status, because of language access, because of the barriers that exist to accessing care. We're going to still see those high numbers. Latinas face severe barriers in accessing basic health care, including lack of access to transportation and barriers for immigrant women, particularly those who are undocumented. And these barriers contribute to health disparities, real health disparities. Latinas are disproportionately impacted by cervical cancer incidences and has one of the highest mortality rates. Cervical cancer is almost 100% preventable if you can get the care that you need and the treatment early. And Latinas are twice as likely than their white peers to experience unintended pregnancies due to a large part because of lack of access to sexual health information and contraception. But our community does not accept that lack of access to health care is the norm. We know that Latinas, including Catholic Latinas, oppose discrimination that denies women access to the care that they need, including when that discrimination is justified by religious belief. The current contraceptive coverage benefit that demonstrates how for-profit and religiously affiliated employers are out of touch for what many women think, including Latinas. Interference by these employers in the personal health decisions of their employees is meddling and harms women's health, particularly when Latinas and other women already face barriers to obtaining employer-sponsored health care, often, again, due to immigration status or some of the employment sectors that women are hired within. An overwhelming majority of Catholic Latinas believe in the coverage of contraception by public and private insurance plans, and many will use that contraception at one point in their life. As Terry said, 99% of sexually active women have used a form of contraception at one point in their life. 96% of sexually active Catholic Latinas have used a form of contraception at one point in their life. 89% of Latina voters, 18 to 34, support the contraceptive coverage without copays to all women. And it's clear that Latinas value and support contraceptive access for all, regardless of one's employer or the type of job they have. This is coverage that's banned by the Vatican, right? That the bishops are putting forward. And the majority of Latino voters, through polling that we've done, believe that abortion should remain legal despite the views of church hierarchy. And I want to underline hierarchy because the people in the pews, their comrades, are supportive. The impact of employers meddling with women's health coverage can be severe, especially when affordable contraception is so important to Latina health. In fact, 57% of young Latinas 18 to 34 have struggled with the cost of prescription birth control. We hear from the ground of people skipping a month, not accessing care, borrowing from friends, and ending up pregnant because there's not consistent use because of costs. But contraception is far from the only health care endangered by refusals based on religion. Latinas and other women also face many obstacles to obtaining safe, affordable legal abortion care, including the barriers provided by religious refusals. Just like the TRAP regulations or restrictions on insurance coverage for abortion care, religious refusals are another way to deny Latinas their ability to make their own decisions about pregnancy and parenthood. Religious refusals make it harder for women to access reproductive health care from religiously affiliated hospitals, especially when those hospitals are often the only source of care in their community. Even when there's providers at these hospitals who are willing to provide the care, they can't get it. This falls hardest on the women who live in 87% of U.S. counties where there's no abortion provider. And religious refusals will also disproportionately impact immigrant women who seek emergency care, who live in geographically isolated communities, and whose experiences of sexual assault and need for quick access to emergency contraception is often challenged. So the barriers to accessing abortion are also at odds with our community's views. We know that a majority of Latinos support a woman's ability to make her own decisions about abortion without political interference. So we know that Latinas already face formidable barriers to care. We know contraception, they use contraception, they support reproductive health care, including abortion, and that contraception and abortion are part of overall Latina health. So what's the direct impact on individuals? The reality is that religious refusals deny life-saving reproductive health care, including abortion care, when women need it most. So a quick story. In 2010, a woman who has been 15 weeks pregnant with twins arrived at the Sierra Vista Emergency Department after miscarrying one of the twins at home. The doctor who examined her recommended that she end her pregnancy, given the low chances of successful pregnancy and the risk of attempting to continue the pregnancy, including severe hemorrhaging and infection. Early in 2010, Sierra Vista Regional Health Center became affiliated with Catholic Cardinal Health Network. As part of the affiliation, Sierra Vista had to follow the directives issued by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. These directives prohibit a wide range of reproductive health services, such as contraception, sterilization, and abortion. The physician and the staff began routine preparations to complete the miscarriage. A hospital administrator intervened and ordered the physician to transfer the patient. She was sent to a hospital 80 miles away where she received the care that she needed. But who knows what could have happened in an 80-mile journey? For Latinas, particularly those who are undocumented, an 80-mile journey can be intersecting a ICE agent, right? There might be a lot of barriers to getting from one place to another. It's not just a drive. They may not have a car. They may not have resources. Distance and transportation are real barriers in our community. So this story makes it painfully clear. Refusals to provide care endanger women's health and indeed their lives. We're also deeply concerned about the religious refusals on Latino LGBTQ individuals, as we heard from the panel before, who are denied care because of mistreatment and because of discrimination at the hands of providers and institutions. LGBTQ patients cannot trust that most providers will have any expertise in health issues that affect them. And there are documented cases of physicians refusing to treat transgender patients with many reproductive cancers. In fact, the National Transgender Discrimination Survey found that 23% of Latino transgender respondents had been refused medical care due to bias, and that 36% reported having been refused, having postponed care when they were sick or injured due to fear of discrimination. Undocumented transgender respondents were found to be particularly vulnerable to physical attacks in doctor's office, hospitals, and emergency rooms. So Jenny actually mentioned the Guadalupe Benitez case, which I think is a real clear intersection of reproductive justice, LGBTQ liberation, equality, and kind of where religious refusals come into play there, and how it impacts personal decision-making and the ability to create the families that you wish to create. So in each of these cases and statistics, it makes it clear employers, providers, institutions shouldn't use religious beliefs to deny the care that our community deserves. As advocates for salud, dignidad y justicia, health, dignity, and justice, we need to ensure that every person is able to get the health care that they need based on their own personal decisions. We must monitor these issues carefully and ensure that the well-being of our community does not continue to be compromised because of the discriminatory beliefs of some imposed upon others that have long-lasting harms to Latinas, their families, and their communities. Thank you.
I'll try. Are you keeping time? Okay, I will as well, just to be sure. All right. Great. Wonderful to see such a great audience, especially towards the end of the day. And a special thanks, of course, to Catholics for Choice and National Council of Jewish Women for hosting the event, and to GW as well. Last April, at a session of the Pennsylvania legislature during which a harmful anti-abortion bill was being debated, Representative Brian Sims told his colleagues, "Each of us put our hands on the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution. We did not put our hands on the Constitution and swear to uphold the Bible." It's a small change in words, of course, but as we know, it means everything. We don't think of our country as a theocracy, and indeed it's not. In principle, at least, our laws are based on what's best for the most people. Generally, our laws are not premised on notions of biblical morality. Unlike many parts of the world, the United States has no laws banning blasphemy or religious insult. But when it comes to women's rights, and in particular, when it comes to reproductive rights, all bets are off. It's as if our standard political process is paused and a temporary insanity takes hold. In virtually every arena that you can think of touching on reproductive rights and health, our nation's policies are guided by theocratic precepts without regard to science or public health. The examples of this are legion. Abstinence-only education, supporters of which claim that it reduces teen pregnancy and delays the onset of sexual initiation, despite numerous peer-reviewed studies proving the opposite. Trap laws, or targeted regulations of abortion providers, such as those requiring doctors to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals, are usually introduced by opponents of abortion who claim to be concerned with a woman's health. But the result of laws like this, including, for example, a law being proposed in Alabama, would, if upheld, force the state's 5 remaining abortion clinics to close. Instead of making abortion safer for women, it would eliminate women's ability to obtain safe, legal, high-quality care if they decide to end a pregnancy, inevitably driving some women to seek unsafe procedures outside the law, the very opposite of protecting their health and safety. Emergency contraception. Opponents of emergency contraception often invoke the need to protect women's health and argue that its health risks, such as those associated with Plan B, are unknown. But in reality, opponents are focused on the fear that over-the-counter access to Plan B will encourage young women to have more unprotected sex. President Obama himself ignored the FDA's finding that women of all ages can safely use Plan B, instead resorting to, quite literally, a patronizing father knows best attitude. As the father of 2 daughters, he intoned, "It is important for us to make sure that we apply some common sense to the various rules when it comes to over-the-counter medicine." To President Obama, common sense means apparently basing federal policy entirely on his beliefs rather than on established and tested science. Now, of course, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the upcoming Supreme Court decision in Hobby Lobby and Conestoga, which you may have heard about already this morning, which, of course, involved challenges to the contraceptive coverage benefit by corporations and their owners who seek a religious exemption from the requirement of covering contraceptives for their employees. As such, my remarks will focus primarily on these cases, looking at both the U.S. law, but also on what we can learn as Americans from the international milieu. 555 days. That's how long it's been since, and I quote, "our most cherished liberty was thrown in the government dumpster and hauled away." At least according to Matt Smith, president of the Catholic Advocate. 555 days since, quote, "the end of freedom as America has known and loved it," according to L. Brent Bozell of the Conservative Media Research Center. Or, not to be outdone, as Representative Mike Kelly, this is a member of our Congress, you can think of the days America was attacked. One was December 7th, that's Pearl Harbor Day. The other is September 11th, and that's the day the terrorists attacked. I want you to remember August 1st, 2012, the attack on our religious freedom. That is the day that will live in infamy, along with those other days. To the rest of us, of course, August 1st, 2012 was the day to celebrate, the day that 99% of American women of reproductive age, who, as we've heard, have used contraception, including 98% of sexually active Catholic women, saw their access to contraceptive commodities and services increase dramatically. On that date, the contraceptive coverage benefit of the Affordable Care Act went into effect. But to Mr. Smith, Mr. Bozell, and Mr. Kelly and their allies, the contraceptive coverage benefit was nothing more than an assault on their religious sensibilities, which holds that contraception is sinful and that emergency contraception is akin to abortion, never mind the science to the contrary. That these three men were among the three most vocal critics of the policy has unfortunately been par for the course. Indeed, men have been largely at the forefront of decrying the policy's impact on women's reproductive health care, culminating in the rather odd spectacle of a group of decidedly celibate men, the Catholic bishops, leading the charge to deny women's access to reproductive health care. The key case in the issues of the Supreme Court we'll soon hear is whether the contraceptive coverage benefit, as applied to for-profit corporations, violates the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The precedent that these corporations seek to set, that a corporation has corporate religious conscience, quote unquote, entitled to protection from government policies its owners do not like, is potentially breathtaking in scope. It threatens to undo not only this particular policy, but also a vast array of consumer protection, land use, non-discrimination, and environmental protection laws. In light of what's at stake, and in fact that this, by its nature, is largely undiscovered legal territory, it's important for the Supreme Court to look not only at the laws and policies of this country, but also at foreign and international law, both sources of interpretive guidance that the Supreme Court has turned to many times before. Now, first, it's important to realize that securing women's access to affordable contraception is a compelling U.S. interest, both under domestic law and under foreign and international law. Second, international and foreign practice make it clear, I'm just going to check my time here, that religious refusals can only be invoked by individuals with a close nexus to the act in question, not by corporations with a distant connection to the activity. And finally, and most importantly, the argument made by corporations in favor of their supposed religious freedom ignores the important countervailing rights of their employees. Now, let's start at the beginning. With respect to the importance of contraception in women's lives, as Justice O'Connor found, quote, "the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of this nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. And similarly, the World Health Organization has found that women's ability to control their fertility has, quote, led to a profound shift in the lives of women and an opportunity for enhanced participation in public life." And certainly access to contraception is an international priority. The 1994 Cairo Program of Action, endorsed by 178 countries, including, no joke, this one, emphasized that reproductive rights are human rights and that states ought to, quote, "make available a full range of effective contraceptive methods." The Human Rights Committee, which is the monitoring body of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has similarly recognized that a woman's ability to control her reproductive decision-making through the use of contraception is deeply rooted in fundamental rights, such as the right to equality and non-discrimination. And as a state party to this treaty, the United States is obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill the terms of the covenant. Tellingly, the Obama administration itself has cited the Affordable Care Act, which includes, of course, the contraceptive coverage benefit, as evidence of our nation's compliance with the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Another parallel between U.S. law and international and foreign law is the notion that religious objections can only be interposed by people with a close nexus to the objected to procedure. It's no coincidence, therefore, that while the United States has a series of laws relating to conscientious objection, they generally only apply to doctors performing procedures to which they object. Now, even if we assume for the time being that corporations are entitled to quote-unquote corporate conscience rights, the link between a shareholder or corporate owner and an employee's decision to use her insurance to get birth control is really distant at best. It's ultimately not that different than, for example, an employer objecting to what an employee does with his or her paycheck. The relevant international and foreign laws in accord. Writing for the World Health Organization, Professors Rebecca Cook and Bernard Dickens note that, quote, only professionals who otherwise would be required to perform services directly on patients can invoke grounds of conscience for purpose of exemption. Similarly, the Constitutional Court of Columbia, of course, a very Catholic country, has noted that the right of healthcare providers to refuse to perform medical services exclusively applies, quote, to direct service providers. Norway's law on the subject is even more explicit and, quote, applies only to health personnel who either perform or assist in the operation itself and not those who attend to, nurse, or treat the woman before or after the operation. And the laws of other developed countries like Spain, the United Kingdom, and Italy are similarly in accord. But finally, and most importantly, those proposing expansive religious opt-outs ignore the impact on beneficiaries themselves. In other words, those pushing for expansive opt-outs have a singular concern for the corporations and the corporate owners, but nary a thought for the employees whose health insurance benefits are to be restricted based on the employer's or the corporate owner's religious beliefs. The dispute cannot be fairly reduced to a conflict between those who support religious liberty. All sides agree that religious liberty is a bedrock American value and worthy of protection. But so are equality, fairness, and non-discrimination. And what's at issue in the debate is not whether anyone's freedom is at stake, but whose freedom is at stake. The dozens of employers who object to the fact that some employees may decide to access reproductive health care through their insurance plans, or the tens of thousands of employees who risk losing essential health care coverage based on their employer's religious beliefs. The issue here can be summed up as the common saying, your right to swing your arm ends where my nose begins. In other words, you can exercise your rights without restraint up until the point where doing so would interfere with my rights. It's that simple. The Supreme Court, in its religious liberty cases, has taken this maxim to heart. The common thread in the court's exemptions-related cases is that the religious burdens on non-beneficiaries the religious exercise protected in each instance that's upheld did not or would not impose substantial burdens on non-beneficiaries while allowing others to act according to their religious beliefs, nor would exemptions that have been upheld impose a monetary cost on those who oppose the religious instruction. But that's exactly what is at issue here. In fact, taking a corporate conscience into account imposes a very real health and financial costs and imposes it on the employees who are least able to shoulder it. In contrast, exempting employers from the contraceptive coverage benefit would directly impose a cost, as I've mentioned. A woman's reproductive life is very much at stake depending on whether her employer will cover contraception. Indeed, in the study that recommended the actual contraceptive coverage benefit, the Institute of Medicine explained how vital affordable contraception is for women's health and, where pregnancies are taken to term, for children's health as well. But the arguments made in these two cases before the Supreme Court focus exclusively on the rights of corporations to interpose religious objections rather than looking at the right of women to receive these healthcare services. Concern for the rights of beneficiaries as against religious objectors is the hallmark of international jurisprudence around religious refusal laws. For example, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in a case called Pichon and Serjou against France that pharmacists did not have the right to conscientiously object to providing contraceptive pills to customers with valid prescriptions. The pharmacists invoked Article 9 of the European Convention, which gives the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But the European Court of Human Rights reasoned that Article 9 does not, quote, always guarantee the right to behave in public in a manner governed by one's religious beliefs. And it concluded that the pharmacists cannot give preference to their religious beliefs and impose them on others as justification for their refusal to sell such products. In a subsequent case by the court, RR versus Poland, our court took an even firmer stance, saying that states are obliged to organize their health systems in such a way as to ensure that the effective exercise of freedom of conscience of health professionals does not prevent patients from obtaining access to services to which they are entitled. Other high court decisions from around the world take a similar line, including the Colombian Constitutional Court, Portugal's Ministry of Health, and so on, as well as the canons of ethics of the World Medical Association and the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, which explicitly requires that objecting physicians not only refer patients to a non-objecting physician, but even perform an emergency service if necessary to save the health of the patient. It's good to know what the law is at home and abroad, but at the end of the day, what can be done? With respect to the contraceptive coverage cases, we need to advocate our position with equal vigor before the Supreme Court and the Court of Public Opinion. We need to point out the folly and wastefulness in investing our money in policies which are ineffective at best and dangerous at worst. And whether that's advocating against wasteful abstinence-only programs or challenging President Obama's father knows best attitude to emergency contraception access, or with respect to the TRAP laws, or the targeted regulation of abortion providers, working with lawmakers to introduce a law, like the Women's Health Protection Act, recently introduced in the Senate and House, is a forward-looking piece of legislation that would preempt state attempts to enact barriers to abortion access under the guise of protecting women's health. We don't have to look far to see where the world is heading, worlds where an institutional conscience trumps individual rights. And in fact, I had in my presentation an example very similar to the one that Jessica gave just now about a Catholic hospital interposing its own beliefs to prevent doctors from saving a woman's life. The doctors were told you may not intervene as long as there's a fetal heartbeat. And this is in the case of a wanted pregnancy with a miscarriage. In closing, the Hobby Lobby and Conestoga cases threaten to fundamentally change the balance between the rights of a would-be objector and the rights of those who would be harmed by that objection. When faced with this threat, we ought to heed Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's wise advice. Those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must therefore answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so very poorly? Thank you.
I'm Sara Hutchinson. I'm with Catholics for Choice. This morning we heard the legal questions about these issues, both from the LGBT community, from women's health community, from women's rights, and employment law. We also heard the really strong cementing the idea that religion and people of faith are decidedly with the majority of us on religious liberty and what that means. Maya and Jessica spoke about the disproportionately affected populations. And Aram gave us a very good perspective on the international realm and how the United States fits in on these issues. But what I think that I want to focus my thoughts on are who's behind the other side of this. We know that people of faith, for example, are decidedly for women's autonomy. They are not against reproductive rights. They are for freedom, health, justice, and religious liberty. And I'm not going to repeat the messages from this morning's faith panel to cement that, but I think that the important point is that women's religious liberty has been undermined by the Catholic bishops time and time again. It bears repeating that the Catholic Church is not the 70 million Catholics here in the United States. only 300 of which are bishops. So when the bishops speak as the Catholic hierarchy, they do not represent the majority of people's faith, the majority of people's opinion, the majority of U.S. Catholics' actions on these issues. We've heard John iterated early this morning, some of the examples of this. The human trafficking services under the TVPA, not including sexual and reproductive health services that the bishops, when the bishops took the contracts. PEPFAR funding and programs without provision of family planning, condoms, and supplies. But I'm going to focus my remarks on how the bishops got involved and continue to be involved in the Affordable Care Act and what they've done to undermine women's religious liberty, freedom, and rights. The first thing that the bishops did was they forced a vote to remove abortion coverage, and eventually won the separation of funds, creating barriers between some funds and the funds for abortion coverage in the Affordable Care Act and the exchanges. Now they've moved on to not only pushing the exemptions and exclusions for contraceptive coverage for any religiously affiliated organization or business, but really they want the mandate disallowed altogether. That's their ultimate goal. To begin with, I want to just give a brief overview of what happened in the Affordable Care Act before it was law. The exhibition of political opportunism that led up to the Affordable Care Act in Congress and the healthcare reform debate in Congress. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the lobbying arm of the Catholic hierarchy here in the United States, took advantage of the partisan rancor and the in-party fightings within the Democratic caucus especially, and sought to really derail any healthcare reform that would have improved the access of reproductive health care for women. They may have said otherwise, but they were not actually comfortable with the status quo, that taxpayer funding was not supportive of abortion care in federal policies. They found allies, on both sides of the aisle who really wanted to make abortion and family planning less accessible for women across the United States. In the House of Representatives, Representative Bart Stupak, formerly Congressman from Michigan, and Representative Joseph Pitts demanded a last-minute vote, which was the only vote, the only amendment allowed to vote on the House floor before the House passed the Affordable Care Act, what became the Affordable Care Act. These men demanded a last-minute vote on their amendment to ban almost all access to abortion in the Affordable Care Act. The amendment had been drafted in collaboration with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. The other representatives on both sides of the aisle were very unhappy that this was the only the only vote that was allowed on this issue during the debate. On the Senate side, Senator Ben Nelson of Nebraska drafted the Senate's anti-choice amendment, which was eventually included in the law. And he, again, delayed his submission of his amendment so that the bishops could look it over and approve it. After the Affordable Care Act was passed, with Mr. Nelson's provision involved to separate funds, the bishops weren't finished. In collaboration with their allies in Congress and with the Catholic Health Association, the USCCB promoted extremist federal legislation year after year after year to chip away at both the Affordable Care Act and other existing law and enact broad, expansive refusal clauses, instituting both the refusal clauses for a broader range of services and entities that can object, and also ludicrous insurance restrictions. Just recently, H.R. 7 in the House of Representatives was passed, the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, which really bans access to abortion from almost all private insurance companies. And the Blunt Amendment in the Senate, which was fortunately stopped, was an earlier iteration of this 2 years ago. These efforts targeting coverage for abortion and now contraception also encompass any healthcare service to which any individual or any entity, be it insurance plan, hospital, university, business, to covering, providing, or even referring and discussing these issues. The reality is that policymakers caved when the Affordable Care Act was in debate, when confronted with a cassock and a collar. One only really need to look to Catholic healthcare for the playbook that the bishops are following. The ethical and religious directives that govern Catholic healthcare provide no access to abortion for any reason, including cases of rape and incest. No contraception, no treatment for ectopic pregnancies, no IVF or assisted reproductive health procedures, no embryonic stem research or benefits from existing research, no respect for advanced medical directives on end of life of care, no respect for family medical proxies or for unacceptable relationships, no autonomy for medical professionals or patients, while the bishop has the final say on which decisions they're allowed to make. The reality of this also is that the Obama administration continues to bend a knee to this playbook, continues to bend a knee to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and their allies. As the contraceptive coverage rule in the initial stages of process, in September of 2011, the bishops formed their ad hoc committee on religious liberty. It's chaired by Bishop William Lori, now the Bishop of Baltimore, Archbishop of Baltimore. And on that initial wish list that the committee described why the committee was being formed and what they planned to do, former USCCB President Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who's the Cardinal of New York, included 6 religious liberty concerns that John's mentioned this morning. 5 are directly related to sex and sexuality reproductive rights. The 6th directly related to workers' rights and their ability to hire their own, the ministerial exception. The wish list includes allowing certain religiously affiliated employers the right to deny benefits. They wish for conceding special rules for certain religious grantees seeking federal and social service contracts. Lessening the requirements for comprehensive strategies like reproductive health services in international relief and development programs such as PEPFAR and some of the examples that Aram gave us. Litigating and legislating and opposition to marriage equality at the federal and state levels. And as I said before, the ministerial exception, which allows them to decide who is working in a ministerial capacity. This is what the ad hoc religious committee was built to do. This was their wish list. The bishops and their allies talk about religious liberty, but they're really seeking a license, and the policymakers help to license them to discriminate against anyone and any service that they think should be controlled. Advocates for healthcare reform, reproductive health care, religious liberty, and conscience, as well as elected officials, need to be clear. The bishops' campaign is much, much broader than simply limiting contraceptive coverage, and it certainly endangers nothing less than the religious liberty rights and conscience of each and every woman, each and every worker, medical professionals across the United States. What happens to politicians when bishops and religious leaders step into the political arena and start throwing their weight around? The Obama administration has shown that they will repeatedly bend over backwards to try to appease the bishops and their demands for more and more accommodation for the bishops' brand of religious liberty protection. Women's health and their religious liberty to choose the health care that best suits them and is best for their families and their health should not be and is not a political bargaining chip. To gain political favor with a small yet vocal minority who are neither elected nor representative of the majority of opinion that they purport to represent is simply not what we think is right. The bishops are not going to stop with what they've gained already. Stephen Colbert may be friends with Cardinal Dolan, but doesn't mean he agrees with him. And I think his colleague Jon Stewart put it best on his show, The Daily Show, when he concluded recently, just because someone works for you does not mean that they can control your personal lives. Be it part of the Colbert Nation does not necessarily give him the right to set the laws for the nation, for the U.S. nation. That extends to employees of his comedy show, as well as that of a nursing home run by nuns, a craft store owned by an evangelical Christian family, an office run by the Catholic Church, a Catholic university, or any other entity, be they mom and pop or the largest and oldest institution. We've heard today time and time again that religious freedom is an expansive idea rather than a restrictive one. It has the two sides. freedom of religion and freedom from religion. It's not about telling people what they can and cannot believe or practice, but rather about respecting an individual's right to follow his or her own conscience in religious beliefs, in practice, as well as in moral decision-making. The protections we put in place to preserve religious freedom do not and should not be permitted to extend to religious institutions or to individuals who seek to obstruct or coerce another's conscience. No matter who you work for or no matter what you believe, what they believe, the institution does not have the right to impose those beliefs on you. The institution does not have the right to discriminate or treat you differently by leaving you out of a benefit that everyone else affords simply because they are your boss. Certainly, the federal government should not be in the business of writing a permission slip for these to do so. The religious liberty belongs to everyone, each of us by our own beliefs, by our own conscience, free to decide for ourselves what is right, what is best, and how we exercise freedom. That's real religious liberty, no matter what you believe. Women's rights are human rights. Religious liberty means religious liberty for everyone. Thank you.
As you heard, I'm Lois Backus, and I just want to say to my colleagues at CFC how excited I am to be here. And Medical Students for Choice was so excited to be one of the founding members of the coalition. And I want to share with you a different perspective today. I'm sure, just like most of you in the room, you'll understand when I say that I was always pro-choice. I don't recall a time in my life when I did not identify that way. But in 1990, for the first time, I really found myself having to deeply reflect what that identity meant for me as a reproductive rights leader and a reproductive health provider, because Pennsylvania passed the Abortion Control Act. And I was the executive director at that time of a small, largely rural Planned Parenthood affiliate in the middle of Pennsylvania. And we already were sending several hundred of our patients out for chosen abortions to difficult circumstances. And it was that occurrence, the passage of that very restrictive law, that made us all go, oh, we really need to think about providing this service for our patients. And what it came down to for me personally was that if I was unwilling to step up, who else would? Well, the 3-year path that I took to provide abortions to the women of central Pennsylvania was enlightening in many, many ways. I worked with wonderful, wonderful physicians who came out of the woodwork to volunteer their time to make sure that women would not have to incur additional costs to comply with the Abortion Control Act. They even made house calls to ensure that women would not have to make 2 trips to the clinic. On the other hand, it took me 3 years to find a doctor trained and willing to provide abortion services for those women. I was shocked, and what I found out about what I felt was the total disregard for the mission of medicine ultimately led me to Medical Students for Choice. Medical Students for Choice was born in 1993 out of the violence against physicians that began at that time. The targeting of abortion providers and those who worked in abortion clinics illuminated for medical students across the country the many gaps in their education. In fact, their education was largely silent, not just on abortion issues, but also on many topics related to family planning. 20 years later, this situation has improved somewhat, but it persists. For instance, although almost all medical schools in the United States provide some education, 15 minutes on oral contraceptives, fewer than 75% of the schools in the U.S. provide any other education on any other forms of birth control. And regarding abortion, fewer than 2/3 of the medical schools in the country provide any education around abortion. And most shocking, simple education on how to talk with your patients about all of her options when facing an unintended pregnancy is only available at 1 out of every 5 schools. So MSFC has a big job in front of it. As a patient, I know that I always assumed that that contraceptive information that I could get very easily from the mainstream media was information I could count on my doctor to have. At MSFC, I've learned that's not true. These gaps in physician education are exacerbated, of course, in the rural and highly politically conservative areas of the country. For instance, 60% of Southern schools provide some education about IUDs, but 83% of the schools in the Northeast do. And even in areas such as DC, I was curious earlier today about someone saying even Georgetown should be considered enlightened. In areas such as DC, where we might expect medical education to be more enlightened, or at least neutral on the controversial aspects of healthcare, factors such as the growth of Catholic hospital systems have presented an enormous challenge. A student at GW who was assigned, he did not have a choice, to do his OB/GYN rotation at a Catholic hospital had this to say. On my first day of rounds in obstetrics at Holy Cross Hospital, I was informed by the teaching resident that although all obstetrical texts include contraceptive planning as a routine part of postpartum care, hospital policy forbade me from mentioning or discussing any contraceptive options with any patients. Now, as a medical student with education and evaluations perpetually in the balance, certainly one of our most delicate skills to learn is when it's okay to speak up. But this was decidedly different, he says. Patient care was at stake. There I was on morning rounds, trapped between dogma and a standard of care, a clear standard of care. It's clear that we live, train, and work in environments that do not always provide safe, dignified, or comprehensive reproductive health care. This student is one of thousands who routinely face religious or morally based judgments on the topics they choose for their research or the topics they choose for their elective events. Very often, this adverse pressure comes from a fear of controversy or an asserted religious belief or concern that someone will object. For instance, a student in South Dakota who chose to do her required women's health paper on emergency contraception received a D because her professor said that she chose a topic that was insensitive to the Catholic students in the class. This is a state university, by the way, University of South Dakota. Medical students enter medical school with the same varied cultural and religious beliefs that all of us have. And as with all of us, exposure to new experiences further develops those values and may even change them. At MSFC, we measured whether exposure to abortion training would change students' attitudes towards the reasons that women cite for having an abortion. We found that simply attending our conference on family planning had a strong positive effect. Now, keep in mind, our conference on family planning attracts between 300 and 400 medical students every year. And these are self-identified pro-choice medical students interested in women's health care. Prior to the conference, only 50 to 60% of them said that they supported women choosing abortion for economic or educational reasons. After the conference, that number jumped to 75% or more. Just talking about abortion and becoming comfortable with the very human feelings behind women's choices has a powerful impact, I hope, on the care these young physicians will provide to their patients in the future. In other research, we've found that there is a clear connection between religious beliefs and abortion provision. So in general, people who say they are highly religious are less apt to provide abortion. We have an alum who has spent her entire life in the South and is a practicing physician, but she's also always identified as highly religious. She is a lay leader within her congregation, but she lives in a very small city in the South, and until Dr. Tiller was murdered, she had never felt safe disclosing to her congregation that she provided abortions. On the other hand, for this young woman, she also did not let that fear stop her from providing. Within the reproductive health movement, we've really tried to counter the oppressive results of anti-choice co-opting of personal conscience. So there's been a lot of work done and a lot of success on changing the framework of abortion training programs from opt-in to opt-out by providing funding to residency programs to enable them to add abortion training to their curriculum. And these efforts have had a tremendous impact on the availability of abortion training for residents. But in the past several years, despite a growing demand for access to this training, we've seen dramatic losses in training opportunities. And most of these losses are directly due to policy changes, both public and private. In 2008, our reproductive health externship program that provides financial support to students to go anywhere in the country to gain this education and experience had more than 100 willing abortion-providing sites working with us. Last year, fewer than 60. This externship experience provides for students much more than exposure to abortion. It gives them a real-life picture of the women who seek abortion, of the way that the care is provided, and what they say is most powerful about the experience is the women's stories. Specifically, I wanted to share with you that last year, only 6 Planned Parenthood affiliates in the U.S. hosted students in the reproductive health externship program. And so far in 2014, 2 of those affiliates have said they will no longer accept students. Roughly 1 out of 4 NAF facilities will accept medical students. In Florida, there are 33 NAF clinics and only 5 accept medical students. And at least 2 of the 29 family planning fellowship sites will not be accepting medical students for 2014. We know from MSFC's founders' research that developing an intention to provide abortion before a student goes into residency is several times more powerful than any other factor influencing their future abortion provision. I believe this is because medical students are still forming their values and beliefs at a time when they can still make choices and take actions that put those beliefs to work. I like to think that MSFC's work goes way beyond creating abortion providers and pro-choice physicians. And in fact, it creates the kind of physicians that we all hope we have: caring, non-judgmental, and thoughtful. No matter what specialty an MSFC member chooses, you can be sure that that student and that future doctor will be more sensitive to the needs of his or her woman patients. I'd like to close with the words of one of our alumni who has expressed her commitment to reproductive justice in an extraordinary way by stepping in to provide abortions in Wichita, Kansas. She says, "If I felt intimidated by doing this, so would everyone else. Didn't I get this training so that I could increase access? These were abortions that would not be done if I did not do them. The only reason why I would not do this would be out of fear. Fear of harassment, fear of violence, fear of terrorism. I had the training, they had the need. I decided that if women in Kansas or anywhere went without services because of fear, then that was a victory for terrorism. I chose this path, or this path chose me, because of Medical Students for Choice, and for that I am profoundly grateful. Abortion has been gradually pushed to the fringes of medicine. This happened because anti-choice forces attacked abortion, and we doctors did not care enough to fight back. I trust that this young doctor's example will be a powerful one for many of her colleagues, and I hope a heartening one for all of you. Medical students and young physicians, like all of us, make career decisions based on a wide range of issues. Fear is a powerful motivator, and no physician provides abortion care in the U.S. today without at least considering potential threats. With 25 years in this fight, no professional effort has been more difficult than simply finding a well-trained physician willing to provide abortions in communities where that care is not available. I have fought ballot measures, restrictive state legislation, and engaged in advocacy through the courts, but knowing that I helped support the development of that young physician in Wichita is by far the most rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Really wonderful, wonderful presentations. We're going to open it up for questions, and while you all are thinking, we've got a question already. Yes. Do we need a mic? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Ellen Schaefer from the Trust Women Silver Ribbon Campaign. Thank you for terrific presentations, and to everyone for all your really important work. I want to throw out kind of two thoughts. One is thanking you, especially Lois, for reminding us that these attacks have been building over time. In a way, it's not something that's new. Partly, it's been allowed to develop because of the divide that's happened about the people who have been hurt. We know that these effects have been felt primarily by low-income women and women of color, that the Hyde Amendment, excuse me, I have my own medical issues, I'm a little shaky, but the Hyde Amendment and other restrictions have really meant that the unintended pregnancy rate is 5 times higher for lower-income women and women of color than for higher-income women. So that's partly, I think, how we got to where we are now. The other thing, though, is that the other graph line I always point to, and we're all familiar with the Guttmacher graph that shows this spike in anti-abortion legislation in 2011. And I think it's clear, and again, very important, and appreciate the discussion about the role of the Catholic bishops in the Affordable Care Act legislation and subsequent legislation. But I think, again, there's more to it in terms of what is motivating this spike in oppressive legislation and our difficulty in turning the tide. And again, go back to your rousing remarks, Terry, which I appreciate, and the other comments that have been made. I think that we're really stuck, even though so many people, we heard this morning about the attenuation of belief that a lot of churchgoers don't believe in God, that they're not really religious. We haven't figured out a way. We are going back now and starting to educate people about women's biology and what reproductive rights is and what reproductive health care is, but I think we have not figured out a way to militantly and clearly assert women's rights, assert reproductive rights, to figure out how we really marshal the resistance and the opposition to something that clearly has its own character and is in some ways religious, but in other ways is, part of the whole Alec Koch brothers' assault on our democracy and reason. And I think that there is a lot of support for an approach that is perhaps a little bit more direct and militant. And I want to ask you all what you think we do about this and how we go forward.
So militancy to get where we need to go. Comments, and after this set of comments, I am going to ask Megan to come up and complete the moderation. So because I'm going to have to take off, but I really would like to hear the answers.
I'll start. So thank you, Ellen, for those comments. I think you said a couple important things. Can folks hear me? Is this on? Okay. I think, you talked about the impact on low-income women of color, and I think that's why the reproductive justice framework is critical, because it's not just about advancing and protecting their right to an abortion or to access certain services, but looking at all these other factors that often prohibit access to that right. So for many immigrant Latinas, that right is here, and because of their status, because of the language access issues, because of where they live or how much money is in their pocket, that access doesn't exist for them. So we have to look at other policies and other issues that impact women's ability to access those rights, and to be really inclusive about how those different identities impact their own access. In terms of, we believe as an organization, we do policy advocacy, community mobilization, communications, and public education. And one thing that's really critical to our theory of change is that we believe those most impacted will be the agents of change in this work. So it speaks to the level of education, of leadership development, of civic engagement, of community organizing that's critical to create the change that we need. It's not going to happen in D.C. It's not going to happen in the halls of Congress. It's going to happen from the ground. And we really believe in activating our community and giving them a path forward, that not us giving them, but giving them the tools and providing the education and some of the resources to be able to lift their own power and speak truth to power. One of our logos is Soy Poderosa, which means I am powerful in Spanish. And that really means a lot to our community, because we tell them, it's okay you don't have U.S. citizenship. It's okay you don't speak the language. These people who have been elected in your community, they should represent you. And gosh, the women we work with in the lower Rio Grande Valley, they show up in their legislator's office. Just this past week, they delivered 2,500 petition signatures to a local state senator who's anti-choice and said, these issues are critical to us, to our community, to our health, to our well-being, to our family, and we have a voice. And that's just so incredible to see on the ground in the community, so I think that's really critical. And the other thing I do want to say, obviously policy is critical to breaking down those systematic barriers that exist for our communities. And there's a lot of proactive efforts that are happening that we're really excited about. Aram talked about the Women's Health Protection Act, which is really important. Latina Institute and many of us in the room are part of a proactive effort called All Above All. And it's really centering the voices of those most impacted to advance proactive policies and build a groundswell of support to repeal the Hyde Amendment, to ensure that no matter how much money is in her pocket, no matter where they live, where the source of insurance is, that they're able to access abortion care without restriction. So there is movement. It's just a really hard battle. There's a lot of politics, but there is forward momentum, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I think we certainly want to make sure that the folks who are affected are are speaking out and sharing their voices, and the movement of proactive efforts to make sure that we're affirming our rights and standing up is one that's extremely important. But part of the problem that we see especially is when it comes to reproductive health care issues, it's the parable of first they came for me. First they came after the doctors who were providing the services and whether or not they should be allowed to do that and where and when and whether they were protected to do it. Then they came for the abortion services. Then they came for taxpayer funding of actual direct providers. Then they came for contraception. Then they came for coverage of abortion. Then they came for the roads that go to the clinic that might possibly have to have services. Now they've moved on to contraception and LGBT issues and others, and these refusal clauses that are being encoded into law. The importance of moving from the bottom up and organizing at the grassroots level has to be married with us telling truth to power to our friends who don't stand up and say, I'll not get elected and not let this law pass. I'll not bend a knee to these forces that are disproportionately in power and getting their voices heard. They don't represent the majority of Americans and what they think about these issues, and yet they still are getting their way. And so I think the advent of really restrictive legislation at the state level in 2011 and 2012 is just the tip of the iceberg. But that was allowed to happen because the 2010 elections were not paid attention to in the right way. And because of redistricting and because of all of the things that happened at the state level that put the wrong people in power and it didn't matter, those folks are listening now to the forces like the Conference of Catholic Bishops who are pushing their agenda.
Yeah. Is this on? It's on. All right. Actually, I'm really loud anyway. A couple of thoughts. I mean, I think you raise a lot. The two thoughts I have there are when we think about attacks and specifically dealing on abortion, when people think of what's the greatest danger out there to women being able to get abortions, and people say it's a tax on Roe. It's a tax on Roe, and it is to some extent. There have been record numbers of laws in the states and so on. But I would posit just as much, if not more so, it's the continued existence of a different case that people are a lot less familiar with, Harris versus McCrae. And that's the case that said it wasn't about legality of abortion, it was about coverage, and it was about access. And what's interesting in Harris versus McCrae is the dissent by John Paul Stevens, where he says this is not only a terrible policy, what the majority is saying here is if you need an abortion, even to save your life, you have no right. No right. And that's still there. And, this administration lays out a budget proposal. They didn't bracket the language in Hyde. That's still, they said that was okay with us. We're going to keep that in. Why is that? That gets to, I think, the number 2 issue. And that's the issue of stigma. Abortion the other side has been terrific and successful, undoubtedly, in stigmatizing abortion. When the other side wants to erect bills to block abortion access, they say what they want. They don't pussyfoot around. I mean, right? You go and people lining up in the Senate and the House to say what they think about abortion. When our side gets to the microphone, we are so nervous. Our champions are the people who you think are synonymous with abortion rights in the House and in the Senate oftentimes are extraordinarily scared about going there. Even on the recent debate on H.R. 7, the so-called, no taxpayer funding for abortion, right? Our allies were saying, oh, no, don't worry, there's no federal funding for abortion. That was the response. Instead of saying, A, there is, because there is, certainly not, and second saying, well, there is presently, right, in the exceptions that are enumerated, limited, and 2, and there should be a lot more. But no one on our side wants to do that because we've been successfully cowed. And I think until we get to that and we can say, yeah, this is what we're for and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is, or at least put our mouth out there, we're not going to get any results that we're happy with.
Maybe we should give them a training program on how to proudly say abortion.
We've tried.
I'm for that, yeah.
So do we have more questions from the audience? Where are we?
Hey, Rob Keithan with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Thanks for having this. This is a great conversation. I think one of the analysis that some of us, maybe even most of us who approach this from a religious perspective, come with is seeing that there's kind of a disconnect, and that the opposition to reproductive health rights and justice is almost always religious, and that all the laws against abortion are clearly reflective of a religious position that they want to impose on everyone. But the response to that from sort of secular allies tends to be, women's health, public health, but not addressing the religious issues that are underlying that. And it seems like that's changing a little bit, and that this coalition in part is brought about to do that. But I'd be interested in hearing from Jessica and Aram and Lois, what progress have you made, if any, sort of getting your organizations and constituents to engage with the religious dimensions, beyond just saying, religion is playing a negative role? Mm-hmm. Have you tried to do that? What does that look like? What kind of resistance have you met with making kind of a religious liberty argument for access to abortion and other reproductive health services?
Actually, we do that a lot with the medical students, and it is very, very popular, and CFC has been really a wonderful partner in helping to provide. So our student groups in the U.S. alone host over 1,000 educational events on their campuses every year, and probably one of the most popular events is a religious panel. And CFC and in different communities, also RCRC chapters, have been really helpful in finding local community members who can staff those panels so that students can have an open and honest conversation about religious views that are inclusive of abortion and family planning. But we also do that at all of our national and international events as well. And a special shout out to Dan McGuire, who has been a special friend of the medical students for many, many years, and is just a fantastic spokesperson on these issues.
And I'll add, thanks, Ralph, that's a really great question. And I'll give an example of Lucy Felix, who's our coordinator in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. She organizes in churches. They have figured out a way to find common ground and create a space that's safe within the faith perspective and within the faith spaces to bring people along. So it's not, guns blazing abortion, right? That's probably not a good acronym, guns, but it's not kind of running in with that, but it's really meeting the community where they're at on this issue and organizing in spaces where they're at. And we know that faith, and particularly Catholic faith, plays a very important part of many Latino families and their lives. So, that's something that we bring to the work because it's part of us. And my friend Lisbeth Melendez, who's doing this really amazing documentary, who worked on an amazing documentary around faith and Latinos and LGBT issues, there's language around love and dignity and justice that's rooted in faith that is very powerful and has been used for reproductive justice advocacy. So that's how we often approach the work in some communities. And it's about knowing the communities. It's about knowing the families and the folks and the issues and the context. That's really critical. And that's why it's so important to work with people on the ground. But I think we're really mindful of how faith plays a part of the lives of particularly Latinas that we work very closely with. And we make sure to weave that in and integrate that in our organizing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point that you raise. I think, our organization has a lot of strengths, but speaking kind of from the religious perspective is not one of them. We focus really on our legal perspective. We're all lawyers, basically. We're looking at this from human rights law perspective, from a constitutional perspective, or a state constitutional law perspective. So, when you're arguing the law, there's less of a sort of, I mean, you can make the legal arguments based on, does RFRA apply and whose religious rights are at issue here and so on. But I think, the broader point that you raise about having the involvement of folks in the religious community to say that this is not monolithic and it's not religion versus irreligion. It's who's religious, whether religious faith you're respecting, whether it's the corporate owners, what about the religious faith of the employees, but also that there's a huge variance within between different religions and within a religion, of course, right? I mean, the Catholic Church is not monolithic. No faith is monolithic, and I think it's extremely important. I mean, when we, when all of the discussion was going on, and we got requests from, folks across Pennsylvania Avenue on the contraceptive coverage benefit and what would be helpful, it wasn't legal arguments. It was, are there religious groups that can speak out here? And having groups like Catholics for Choice and National Council of Jewish Women and other groups, Baptist, Methodist, whatever it is, I think is extremely important to kind of just, because I think the other side gets to bring not only, it's religion versus, the godless heathens. I think the godless heathens are going to lose. So we don't want that framing.
I think, Rob, I mean, I know that question wasn't posed to me, but I think that we certainly, Catholics for Choice and RCRC have worked tremendously with interfaith spaces. I think, some of the work that Rabbi Ross has done in New York to gather interfaith voices and make us work together and show that it is unified on the side of reproductive rights, for example, on the side of LGBT communities, for example, needs to be married with the, no pun intended, married with the interfaith spaces talking to secular allies, and how those two voices together really make a powerful moment. And right after we teach members of Congress and state legislators who are pro-choice to talk about abortion, we need to teach them to also talk about faith. Because I think that faith is often a motivator for our advocates, our policymakers, our champions, but they just don't talk about it. So I think that those are the three ways that I think that we, as faith communities, can work with our non-faith allies to make sure that those things are more prominent.
And actually, it's just when you're talking about abortion and these issues, I think the one thing I just want to add is that the approach that we have is often from a place of empathy. So we know that abortion's a complicated issue. We understand that there's different moral implications for each person, and that's actually the framework we often use when working with our women, that having and creating that space to have those conversations are so critical, and coming at it with a very empathetic viewpoint, because what we found through polling is, saying something like, no matter how I feel about the procedure, I believe, a woman should be able to make the decision for herself based on her own circumstances. So that's a really good entry point in terms of messaging and the way we talk about the issues on the ground.
I'm just going to throw one other sort of little interesting wrinkle in here that I just thought of, which is, of course, the law that the Supreme Court is hearing this case under largely, revolves on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And there's a concern that these corporations or corporate owners are using the law to assert their own religious interest. An interesting story about the law when it arose was that it was opposed strongly by one group. Not only Jesse Helms opposed it, but the Catholic bishops opposed it, because they were concerned that someone would say, I want an abortion, and my religious belief is that I deserve an abortion, and I should have that, and I don't want to carry this pregnancy to term. I'm not aware of cases that have been brought under that theory, but, there's something there to that, I think. I mean, so...
Tired. It's not a quiet group.
Well, I do have a question for the group. I think, Aram, actually what you just touched on actually complements us pretty well, but we heard in the LGBT panel about this idea of a false dichotomy between religious liberty and LGBT rights. And so I'm wondering if you all have seen a similar false dichotomy, or maybe you think it's an accurate one, between women's health or women's rights and religious liberty. And if so, how do you resolve that? Or what do you actually think about that framework and how it's interplayed in the states and in Congress right now?
Well, I mean, I think I'll start, and anyone, please, especially Lois, I think, can jump in from her proprietor's perspective. you know, we often say, and I think several people today said it, we do what we do, not in spite of our faith, but because of it. And many, many, many people do the work of reproductive health, rights, justice, religious and reproductive freedom because of their faith motivations. So again, I think that the point is that we need to be better about saying that and working with our allies who either don't come from that place, but might also agree that that's a good place to come from, and to be able to talk about it. I think that the other side has done a really good job of owning faith, and it certainly isn't true in the majority of Americans, so we need to do a better job of doing that. I think the Coalition on Liberty and Justice was purposely put together with faith organizations and secular organizations and policy organizations and legal organizations and medical organizations to make sure that we were all working toward the same goal, which is religious liberty for everyone. And I think that being better about not only talking about faith if you're comfortable with it, but being able to talk about liberty and how those intersect with LGBT rights, with reproductive rights, with women's rights, with employment rights. It is about liberty at a basic level.
One of the saddest side effects of the deep co-opting of the conscience framework around women's rights by those who oppose them, women's health rights, is that it has really made it unsafe for strong believers in the connection between faith and conscience and providing abortion and family planning to speak out, and unsafe in a very clear, real-world way. So it's a really difficult question, Megan, because I have had many, many conversations with alumni who have been asked by NARAL or Planned Parenthood to testify in state legislatures on state laws that they know will be passed anyway, and essentially out themselves in the process with no promise that there will be any protection there for them afterward, and with no positive outcome in anyone's wildest dreams on the horizon. And it is really a struggle. So I feel everyone's frustration, and of course I feel the frustration every day, but it's a really tough question.
So with that, I want to thank our last panel of the day for all of their hard work. So, as they're making their way to their seats. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I think that we've had a fantastic forum. We've had great participation from all of you with your questions and your input, and from all of our panelists. So the Coalition for Liberty and Justice, as you've heard from a lot of our members today, was really formed in part because we were angry. We were passionate, as Terry mentioned, about what we saw as a perversion of religious liberty and the First Amendment. But we're equally passionate about our vision. That vision is included in your program materials. And it's also, I think, encapsulated in a lot of what our speakers have said today about their faith beliefs, their secular beliefs, their legal arguments, their medical arguments, and their rights-based and justice-based arguments. So, with that passion, with all of the things that you've learned today, we do want you to also take action. We want you to join us. So what can you do about that? Well, as Jessica said, we're powerful. All of us are powerful. Everybody in this room is powerful. And all of our organizations are powerful, and our connections to other people. And so some of the ways that you can join us are, if you are an organizational representative yourself, your organization can join the Coalition for Liberty and Justice if you have not done so already. If you're an individual and you've been inspired by some of our wonderful speakers today, you can join their organizations. You can take action with them to speak out for real religious liberty. As Dennis mentioned and as Sara mentioned, you can also speak to your own elected officials. Dennis talked about doing it on Monday morning, but you can do it today. You can send an email. You can make a phone call. You can talk about one thing that you've heard today about religious freedom that you didn't know before, and that you want them to be advocating for, about what you want them to take a stand for. Finally, you can also host discussions. We heard earlier today that sometimes it's hard to have conversations around dinner. If dinner's too hard, then host a lunchtime brown bag at your workplace. Send emails to your friends about what you've heard today. Talk on GChat, talk on social media. Or host conversations in your workplace. Host conversations in your classrooms if you're a student or a professor. Or host conversations in your faith communities, in your congregations, or in your secular spaces where you might gather every week. Have those coffee conversations about religious freedom and about what it means to you, and really spread the word about what you've heard today from our speakers. And finally, the last thing that you can do, which is very easy because it will take place in this room, is join me in thanking a lot of very important people who helped us to put this day together. So first, of course, I want to thank all of my colleagues at Catholics for Choice for their excellent work. On the Coalition for Liberty and Justice Steering Committee, I also want to thank Americans United for Separation of Church and State for their leadership, as well as the ACLU for all of their hard work, the Center for Inquiry as well, and the Center for Reproductive Rights. Joining us also in addition to the steering committee members and the co-conveners in the planning of this forum were the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health and the Secular Coalition for America. So thank you to them too. And finally, to our very gracious hosts with George Washington University, Law Students for Reproductive Justice is a national CLJ member, but the GW chapter of LSRJ were our wonderful hosts and helped us in securing this fantastic space and the lunch space that we also had today. So thank you very much to Nicole and everyone with LSRJ at GW. And lastly, but most importantly, thank you to all of you for joining us. We had folks in the room who came from as far away as California. So thank you for being here today, for providing your input, for flying in, and for making your voices heard today and hopefully in the future with all of us. So thank you, and with that, we will conclude our day.